Good morning, everyone. My name is John Bracken. On behalf of the Digital Public Library of America, welcome to what I know is going to be a really interesting and informative conversation with Jen Pahlka about her new book, Recoding America. And I think she's going to go grab a copy to show the title page. My job is twofold. One, just to remind you about the bannedbookclub.info that we launched last week. To help counter the trend of book bans and to make books available where they've been banned. And you can learn all about that at the bannedbookclub.info. And my task is to be able to introduce one of my bosses, Josh Frazier-Sparks, who is the director, who we're very thankful to have as a board member at the Digital Public Library of America. And his day job, when he's not helping us, is as the director of culture, diversity, equity and inclusion at Walmart. And we get Josh fresh back from his vacation. So we're extra thankful. Josh, over to you, and I'll see the rest of you in a little while.
Thanks, John, and welcome and good afternoon, everyone. We are in for a true treat today. I have the pleasure of introducing Jennifer Pahlka for our book chat focused on her book, Recoding America: Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. I first became aware of Jennifer when I was leading philanthropic efforts related to workforce development and heard of this organization called Code for America. They were well known, well respected, and had a resolute focus on the end user and only taking on work that could have a positive impact at scale. Needless to say, Jennifer was the founder of this organization, driving impact and making tech work better for people across our country. In addition, she helped found the United States Digital Service while serving as U.S. Deputy Chief Technology Officer under President Obama. At the start of the pandemic, she also co-founded United States Digital Response, which helps government meet the needs of the public with volunteer tech support. She has received the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship and was named by Wired as one of the 25 people who has most shaped the past 25 years. Jennifer lives in California with her husband and their 7 chickens. And this is not in her bio, but I have to add it anyhow. She has the most amazing sister, Amy. And when my husband and I moved to Arkansas, Amy was one of the first people to make us feel so welcomed. So outside of all the great accomplishments and rooting in my Appalachian identity, Jennifer is just from some really good people. And personally, I'm excited for this conversation today. There are so many processes in government, whether that's our workforce development system, whether that's our benefits system, that just don't work for the end user and the people they need to work for. So when someone goes to a website and they can't navigate it or must complete page after page of the same information, it decreases one's trust and respect in government. And that's an issue that we should all be concerned about. And processes are important, no doubt about it, but not to the detriment of the end user. And so I can't wait to hear about Jennifer's ideas on how to address this and so many other things through the lens of technology. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer to kick the talk off today. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Josh. And the one truest thing that you said is that I do have a really amazing sister and appreciate your giving her a shout out. It is really a delight to be here today with all of you. I have such great respect for what all of you do. And I know that many of you struggle with the same challenges that I talk about in my book, Recoding America. So I'm eager to get to the discussion part of it with Lilian, who will be on in a minute. And Lilian and I, at least in her picture, are wearing matching red, though I think she's wearing something else today. But I'm going to just briefly set up one part of the book and then read from it. And I hope that that's okay, that you're not all falling asleep as I read from it, and then talk a little bit about the lessons from that section. And then Lilian and I will do some Q&A, and then we can all bring you all into the conversation. So the book really is about not so much technology. It's sort of the dysfunctions of government seen through the lens of technology. And as Josh said, absolutely about how to meet the needs of the users of whatever system it is. And in this case, it's government services. But I think we all know that these things are problematic, but digging into exactly why and how this happens, it was sort of the point of the book. The framing for it has really been that there is a gap, a big gap between the intentions of policies and laws that we pass and the outcomes that we want from those. And what's in the middle there is something that we just don't pay enough attention to, which is the implementation of the law and policy. And why are we having all of this fall off between here's the law and its intentions and here's the actual outcomes? What is happening in the middle? So I thought I'd start with a story about very concretely what happens in the middle of one of these things. It's less framed around a law and more just an outcome in the Department of Defense. So let me set it up for you, and then I'll read from the book. So in chapter 4, I tell the story of a team that is working on the software that is going to run the GPS satellites. We're putting new GPS satellites into space because the old ones have worn out and they need new software to keep up with all of the different changes in the various ecosystems. And a team at Raytheon that's been hired by the Air Force is desperately trying to make this work. And a colleague of mine, Matthew Weaver, is sent over to find out why they are delayed and over budget. And what he finds is that while there's a very simple way to get the data from the satellites down to the ground station, that's sort of, a very basic protocol, very simple, kind of like, the protocols that run the web. They're not using that, or they are using that, but in between they have inserted something that you don't need to remember the name of, but called an enterprise service bus, which is a really big piece of software that's very complex. And because it's so messy, we've created now this Rube Goldberg machine that means that the data starts out of the satellites, but it's going through so many machinations on its way down through this enterprise service bus that it's timing out and it's not getting to the ground stations in time. And of course, his first question is, why can't we just take this out? And the answer is, it's been required. It's required in the RFP that the Air Force put out to Raytheon. And so we can't, it's something that has to happen. And Weaver, my friend, goes back and traces the source of that requirement. And it turns out that it comes from the Air Force Enterprise Architecture, which they believe requires it in all these things, which is derived from the Department of Defense Enterprise Architecture, which is derived from the Federal Enterprise Architecture, which turns out to have been created in response to the Clinger-Cohen Act of 1996. And so essentially Congress in a certain way has required this. And so we've just figured this out in the book. And this is some of my observations from this story. It's true that many laws and policies fail because they are overly prescriptive and lock implementers into a narrow set of options. But that is not quite what happened here. In fact, neither the Clinger-Cohen Act nor any other law explicitly required an ESB. Nowhere in the Federal Enterprise Architecture does it say, thou shalt always use an enterprise service bus. There are 5 mentions of enterprise service bus in the document, but all of them are in charts or diagrams listing various application components that could support interoperability. ESBs became mandatory in practice within the Department of Defense through overzealous interpretations of law, policy, and guidance, combined with a lack of technical understanding. How does this happen? When there are big visible delivery failures like healthcare.gov or the unemployment insurance crisis during the pandemic, public servants are trapped between 2 distinct systems of accountability. In the first, politicians will hold the public servants accountable for outcomes, whether the website works to enroll people. In this system, there will be hearings. Congressional committees held 10 separate hearings on healthcare.gov in a single month in 2013, all as the people being called to testify were otherwise working night and day to get the site back up. Angry politicians will summon bureaucrats to the Hill or the state capitol or city council chambers, and their staffs will help them prepare incisive questions that show that they are paying close attention to the problem. These hearings will be likely televised or webcast, and a few sound bites might appear on the evening news or circulate on social media. In the second system of accountability, various parts of the administrative state, the agency itself, the Inspector General, the Government Accountability Office, will hold these same public servants accountable to process. Procurement and planning documents will be reviewed for any gaps, any skipped or partially skipped steps, any deviance from standard protocol, even if that deviance is legal, just non-standard. If an ESB is thought to be best practice, even if it is not best practice at all, why wasn't it used? If anti-fraud practices had previously been established, why weren't all of them deployed? If the vendor has been hired under an other transaction authority, why was this exception allowed and a more thorough and standard process not followed? And who signed off on all these decisions? Angry politicians will sometimes ask such questions too, but they are less familiar with the many administrative rules and requirements. They tend to focus more on the issue their constituents care about. Why isn't the thing working? The accountability trap is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. The first system is extremely uncomfortable for the public servants subjected to it. No one wants to be called up to testify in a televised hearing. No one wants to be in the video clip as a stone-faced bureaucrat with no good answers, being yelled at by a righteous or self-righteous politician fighting the good fight on behalf of the aggrieved public. As painful and sometimes humiliating as these hearings are, if you're a career civil servant, it is the second system of accountability that matters most to you. Legislators can't fire or officially reprimand you, no matter how bad a job they think you did, although they can put political pressure on the administration to do so. They can't make you ineligible for promotions and raises. On the other hand, violations of policy, process, and procedure, real or perceived, can do all of that, even if there is no hearing. It is the job of many public servants to make sure that happens. The people under scrutiny want to avoid these repercussions for the obvious reason that being fired or demoted affects their livelihoods, but many simply also want to continue doing their jobs. They believe in what they do, and they believe that they are still the best shot the agency has at fulfilling their mission. They are often right. These dynamics kick into overdrive when technical issues are in question. Even the most competent tech team can hit resistance when trying to explain, for instance, why there should not be an ESB in the software they are building. A team could point out that it was only suggested, not required, and Weaver tried to do just that. But the reality is that the ESB became more incrementally codified as the federal enterprise architecture gave rise to the Department of Defense enterprise architecture, which gave rise to the Air Force enterprise architecture, which gave rise to some large number of additional guidance documents within the Air Force, and ultimately to the request for proposals and accompanying requirements documents that were issued when the contract was awarded. Arguments about what is or isn't required happen all the time, but they are much less likely to lead to a suffocatingly risk-averse answer when the people involved in the argument understand the domain. Here, aside from the tech team, it is unlikely that anyone else in the debate, likely to be dozens of people in dozens of different roles, had any basis on which to judge whether an ESB was a good thing or a bad thing in this context. Thus, to nix the ESB, dozens of people in dozens of different roles would all have had to agree to jeopardize their jobs over a recommendation they didn't understand. These discussions tend to function as a vetocracy, in which it takes all thumbs up in order to accept the risk and only one thumbs down to stick with the less risky option. The ESB stays. There's a paragraph in here where I describe how this works with the Federal Information Security Management Act, which has to do with cybersecurity, and that's another whole topic, but essentially it ends in the same place. FISMA, as written, is a fine law, but as practiced, it often impairs the security of our systems. As Weaver concluded from his work on the satellites, almost all of the outcomes generated by technical policy will be unintended consequences. In the business world, they say that culture eats strategy for breakfast, meaning that the people implementing the strategy and the skills, attitudes, and assumptions they bring to it will make more difference than even the most brilliant plan. In government, culture eats policy. Even when legislators and policymakers try to give implementers the flexibility to exercise judgment, the words they write take on an entirely different meaning and have an entirely different effect as they descend through the hierarchy, becoming more rigid with every step. When rules rarely have their intended effect, more rules are not likely to improve outcomes. So that is the section I thought I would read, and I hope it sparks some interesting conversation. Obviously, this is just sort of one of the points that I'm trying to make. And I'd like to stress, if you haven't read the book, that if please make it all the way through to chapter 10 and 11 and 12 at the end, where I talk about much more positive examples. So for instance, I think sort of the hero of the book is a woman named Yadira Sanchez, who is a career civil servant at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, who really successfully fights this culture eats policy dynamic. In fact, in the story I just told, despite there being enormous resources put towards getting this software to work so the satellites can go back up into space, the team does not succeed. The satellites did go back up into space. GPS still works, which is great because I need it. I'm constantly lost. Of course, it's needed for many, many other things. But they went back up into space without that piece of software updated. There are many, many wonderful public servants who are able to win on this fight, on these fights, and actually, for instance, the equivalent of getting that ESB out. And what they're doing is empowering themselves to challenge that requirement and say, that's not what's going to work for users. I realize the user in this case is a little abstract, but we need to do what's right instead of what we think was written down. And that's essentially sort of the arc of the book, is going from that sort of disempowerment of being stuck with an ESB to the empowerment of, I know I am low down in the hierarchy here and I'm just implementing a law and policy, but I have a right to say that I'm going to speak for the user, and I have a right to insist on the circumstances that can make us succeed in that. So I hope that is a good starting point for a conversation.
Awesome. It is. And I've got so many things I want to dive into, but that's not my role just yet. My role is to pass the mic to Lilian, who is the head of New America's Technology and Democracy Programs and Senior Director of the amazing Open Technology Institute. Among her highlights is that she's part of the august Knight Foundation Alumni Network. At Knight, she was the Director of National Strategy and Tech Innovation, where she started and ran and developed the Smart Cities initiative at Knight. Prior to that, she was Chief Data Officer in Los Angeles. She's a combination of two of my favorite things, a native Angeline and also a native Andean, as a proud Colombiana, and has a bachelor's degree from UCI and a master's degree from UCLA. And anyway, I'm so excited to sit back and listen to the two of you guys kick this off and go to the next level. Thank you for both being here.
Thanks, John. Jen, it's so great to be in conversation with you, and I love the excerpts you chose. I was going to say, actually, I don't know if I've ever told you, but I'm definitely a beneficiary of you starting Code for America and really starting this movement. Because, and I'll just tell this real quickly because it connects back to the story you just shared. I started my career in policy and advocacy before I even heard of a Code for America. And I used to started my career working for public sector labor unions, working on this issue of how we make policy really come to life and implementation. But in the analog world, this was the early 2000s, where we weren't really taking a look at technology. And it was actually then when I went to work and start up an organization that many folks in the library space are familiar with, within the 211 system. I started up the 211 California system. That's when I learned about Code for America, as we were trying to get these telephone systems onto the cloud and these databases online, and getting all of these organizations to use data and connect with government. And so, one, thank you. I owe you. Then I figured out, I'm like, I want to do more of this. And that is how all roads lead back to Code for America. But I love that you are, I love this focus on implementation, because in some ways, what we've been able to do, and I'm going to summarize, is really create this movement, right? With Code for America really being at the central point of creating a movement that said we need to bring technologists to government. And now getting to a place where we really are, in some ways, and you've said this before, really maturing to the point of looking at, we're going to have to go deep within the organization. And I guess my first big question to you is, because I know that we focused a lot on bringing leadership and the vision to these institutions. These are massive institutions with thousands and thousands and thousands of workers. How do we spread? What are the tools that a Yadira needs, or what are the lessons that you're coming to that someone like Yadira Sanchez that you talked about need to be empowered to be able to be part of that movement? Because it seems to me like now what you're talking about is really growing the movement across these institutions and the individuals within it to feel like they can also take these challenges on. So I'll start there, but I have lots of questions about everything you've described.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start by saying, I think I just want to really stress the framing that you set that question up with, which is we really is, in the end of the day, like implementation that we care about, not technology. Like I came into it through getting better technology, but it's very easy. And I know you know this through your work in New America, and you do a lot of reframing this at New America. It's really easy then to think that this is about better tech. And it's only about better tech to the degree that it helps us get the right implementation. And that really helps people, I think, use tech more appropriately, and oftentimes not use tech because that's not what's needed. What we care about is getting the results that we intended. In the case of Yadira, which I think is somewhat extrapolatable to other, nobody can take credit for Yadira being Yadira. She's just fantastic. Like the story I tell is sort of an arc of hers from being at CMS for about 10 years before healthcare.gov hits. So she had 10 years of already demonstrating that while she, the agency sort of tries to put you in your lane, like you're in the tech lane, and she was never comfortable with that. She was always using, her trainings. She would use her trainings, for instance, to talk to the people she was training about what works for you here, what doesn't. Like, is this thing that we built actually good? Like, do you guys never use these features? Why did we build them? So she was sort of always doing user research. But then 10 years in, she's built a great reputation as being a stellar employee at CMS. Healthcare.gov hits. And first of all, it's a crisis. And I think that's one of the things that's unfortunately true very often when we think about how change happens, is that, at least in this country, we change when there's a crisis. And the other thing that happens is that through that, she gets exposed to a new set of practices, not that she wasn't doing them, but they didn't have names. She said, I'd never heard of agile development until healthcare.gov came along. And then this team that came in to help out, those were the practices they used, and users, talking to users and seeing what's actually happening at the end of the process is, a core practice of that. So she gets the language and the framework and gets to say, this isn't just some crazy thing I'm doing that's, painting out of the lines. This is an actual way that technology development gets done. And then from there, really, I think it's that, the crisis and then the awareness of different methodologies are sort of the seeds that get planted. And whereas earlier in the book, the sort of stories of failure are essentially spirals downward of like something goes wrong. And so people become more risk averse and less empowered. And that actually just feeds on itself. Yadira has the force of will and character and to take these two circumstances and create a reinforcing spiral, a positive spiral, in which the more she does that takes a little bit of risk and gets a better outcome, the more she senses that she's trusted to do that again. And, I end her story with, not only her doing that over and over again, saying this requirement that's been passed down to me isn't going to work, so I'm going to reinterpret what you've said to get the right outcome. But actually, at the end, and I hope this isn't too technical, but she is handed a new law to implement called MACRA. It doesn't really matter what it stands for, but part of it, I'm sorry, this isn't MACRA, this is after MACRA. She's given a requirement from Congress to provide quarterly data extracts for pharmaceutical data that the ecosystem can use. And she says, if I do exactly what you told me to do, it'll be very expensive and people won't have access to the data until 9 months later. I'm just going to write an API, an application programming interface that will allow the people who you intended to have access to this data be able to work with it in real time, better, faster, cheaper. And that is an empowerment, I think, that is pretty unique, in that she's literally saying, I'm not going to do what Congress said, I'm going to do what Congress wanted. And I think those are some of the conditions that existed for her to be able to do that. But I also think it just does come down a little bit to Yadira's remarkable public servant.
Yeah. Well, and I think, as we all know, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of Yadiras out there that we all come across. And so I love hearing from you that really taking a lot of the crisis that government gets into, bringing this awareness of these different skill sets to folks and really figuring out how do we empower them, that there is kind of a recipe for how to ignite them onto a role. So kind of taking a step back, I'm curious as to what prompted you to write the book now, and kind of what in this moment made you feel like this is the time to kind of go deeper on this implementation question, because obviously, yeah, I'd just be curious to see what prompted you there. And then in some ways, what are the opportunities that you're seeing for us to kind of make some good pivots in this space?
Well, that's kind of a funny question, because now is not when I decided to write it. I decided to write a long time ago, and it took me a really long time to write.
Okay.
But I'd hoped for it to come out in 2021. But I was a little naive. I'm glad it came out. I mean, ultimately, I wrote it just because I felt like I had spent 10 years, cultivating a community of wonderful people who believed that, that we could challenge the status quo and get better outcomes, basically. And that while that community is really important and remains sort of central, we needed to start creating messaging that talked outside of that community. You can pretty easily start just preaching to the choir over and over again. And for someone like Yadira, just to stay on her, like, what she needs most and others like her need most is to have a more friendly environment to do the work in which they're doing. So how do we influence the people who can change that environment? We talked about that negative spiral. Well, funding, oversight, HR are like sort of the three big things that really create that negative spiral. And the people like Yadira can't herself change those things. She can't change how her project is funded. She can't change that it takes her like 9 months to be able to hire somebody. And so I want to speak on behalf of those people in a certain sense rather than to those people. They're already doing a great job. On the timing, though, I mean, it's interesting because I was finishing it around the time that we had the CHIPS Act. I guess Infrastructure Act came first, then CHIPS and IRA. And so I'm sort of glad that it came out now, even though, I wished it would come out earlier, but that would have required me writing faster or editing faster. Because those are 3 mega bills with incredibly enormous stakes, right? Like if we don't implement, especially the climate provisions of the IRA, we are seriously, is it okay to say this here, screwed, right?
Yep.
And so the focus now, I think, at federal government, but of course at state and local as well, because state and local has so much to do with the implementation of these laws and policies. Like in my perfect world, once we got that third one in, the entire federal government would have said, like Republicans and Democrats, executive legislative branches all said, guess what our job now is? It's to implement these things. We need to focus on implementation and put all our resources towards now getting the outcomes that were intended. And I wouldn't say that's exactly happening, but I do think there is an increased focus on implementation and increased awareness of the problems of implementation. And I hope that the book spurs that conversation further, even just a tiny bit.
You know, I love hearing that because as John mentioned, I am now working with very closely and heading up our Open Technology Institute, and we advocate a lot for technology policies, mostly for the technology itself and how we're using it. But to your point, there's so much opportunity to actually work on advocacy to create the conditions that can make the use of that technology or the implementation of that technology much more effective. And perhaps I think all of us in civil society need to kind of open up our aperture as to the kinds of things we need to be focusing on. Want to kind of move a little bit to just recognizing the space that we're in. You talk early on in the book about the disintermediation, obviously, that happened with the web and that it didn't happen with government. And the reason why that stuck out for me is in some ways, and library, like a lot of folks on the line can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like libraries are often some of that serve as that kind of in between government and policies and the public. What do you see as a potential role for libraries, or how do we create the conditions even within the library system to be able to take advantage of some of the lessons that you're learning and to even just grow digitally on their own? Obviously, that's the mission of DPLA and likewise, but where do you see libraries in this conversation?
I mean, I think that the superpower of libraries is their closeness to users. And I'm sure that it manifests in many ways that I don't understand, but libraries serve the public directly. They serve people at a time that's very important when they are looking for something, information or entertainment or community. And so I think, really embracing the ways in which libraries and librarians can speak for user needs in those ways that like Yadira does. Like, it's not her job. Like if you look at Yadira's job description, it says nothing about that.
Yeah.
Like technically her job is to check a bunch of boxes, to fulfill requirements, to make things sure things are compliant. But that's just, what she chooses to do is to make sure she understands what people need and are getting them that. And I think to the extent that you're right, libraries not only have that superpower because of, of how they interact with the public, but also that they are intermediaries. I think the more that this community claims that and says, all the way up here, at the, equivalent, right, of like the federal enterprise architecture level or the Klinger-Cohen Act, like you people are doing all these things. They often get it wrong, not because they're bad people necessarily, not that there aren't bad people, but very often there's no ill intent. It's just that the people who are writing laws or guidance or whatever don't have that access to the voice of the user. And so the more that intermediaries like libraries can sort of shout back up the waterfall and say, this is what people really need, and this is how we get it to them. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you need to listen to us. The more of that, the better.
Yeah. No, and in fact, in some ways, John and I know this from our work at Knight Foundation, working with libraries across the US, like libraries have evolve every single time there is an emerging user need, and in some ways create a lot of the programs and the stopgaps for the failures in policy, right? When we get it wrong, it's libraries who sort of stand at the front of it. We want to encourage everyone in the conversation to please share any questions that you may have for Jen. I'm really curious about, again, talking about the dysfunction of government. I mean, where do you see, there is as much as this is about implementation, there is sort of this governance dysfunction question. And where do you see the hope and the opportunity within? There's so much for us to feel oftentimes jaded about in this environment. And even, right now, depending on the state that you're in, how much power do we really have to be able to shout up? Where do you find hope, Jen, in all of this?
Well, I mean, I think when I published the book, that answer would have been Yadira and everybody like her. And I think that, it's good to tell her story, but she was going to keep being a model for people regardless. I mean, her practices are sort of spreading, maybe not as fast as we'd like, but certainly spreading throughout this, like CMS, where she works, is a huge agency. And if it over time starts acting more and more like she does, and then other agencies sort of take note, want to give her credit for the impact she's having without the book. But I'd also say, now that it's come out and I've gotten some reactions, I'll tell you, there was a member of a state legislature who I had worked with during the pandemic and given him some feedback at the time. There's this idea of policy cruft and, the over complexity of policy that I think is a really, really big negative, right? It's so hard to deliver. My example in the book there is unemployment insurance, where, we find out that the claims processors, one of them keeps saying, I'm the new guy, and he says he's only been there 17 years, and that the people who understand this incredibly complex policy have been there 25 years or more. And that actually really is the key reason why unemployment insurance was so problematic during the pandemic and so many people didn't get it, is that you have 90 years of just, accumulation of policy complexity. And this state legislator had sort of ignored me when I said, I don't think putting more mandates on these folks right now is going to get you what you want. If you want to clear the backlog, you need to stop throwing mandates at them, let them focus on their priorities, remove mandates instead of add them. The reason it's so hard for them to get anything done is they have all these things. And he didn't really hear me, but he's since read the book and said to me, oh my God, now I understand what you mean. I want to act differently now. So I am encouraged by I think, with some obvious exceptions, I believe people are generally well-intentioned, especially sort of in the world I work in. And that if they see the negative impacts of their behavior, they will at least try to change it. And I hope that keeps happening, that we have a very long way to go, but I remain hopeful.
Yeah. Where do you see the role of kind of institutions this might seem like an oddball or a curve, but within that dysfunction and the construct of government, I mean, there is, labor unions and all kinds of other, civil society, obviously, organizations. Where do you see their role? What's the opportunity to educate those groups within the structure to also see that we can be implementing and working differently and developing, you called it in the book, just values in a different way? Because you're right, my experience is the same. Even sometimes you're talking to who you perceive to be the adversary, mm-hmm. and it's not, ill-intended individuals. It's just they have a very different value proposition that they come to the table with. So how do we bring those other groups along to develop a shared sense of value around implementation and around the use of technology to drive the outcomes we're looking for?
Oh, that's a super great question. I think I would answer it most specifically in the context of advocates. And the basic thing in there is that I think when you advocate for policy change without understanding the implementation, you can, not succeed. You can also sometimes have the opposite impact, and again, very, very well-intentioned. There was a great example of that in supplemental nutrition assistance SNAP program in California, which is one of the stories in the book, but this part isn't told. advocates had correctly seen that, we need to make sure that SNAP recipients are voting. So they have to get registered to vote. And so they put pressure on the social services agencies to add a question about voter registration at the end of a SNAP application. What they didn't realize is that the SNAP application A was really, really, really cumbersome already. So it was 200, this was in a certain set of counties in California. It's not true of all of them, but in this one, it was 212 questions. It didn't work on a mobile phone, but also, you can get SNAP if you are not a documented citizen of the US. You can't vote. And so you have them, like 45 minutes of going through a really complicated web form to apply for SNAP, in which you're told many times, like, it's okay, you don't have to be, and then you put in a thing about wanting them to register to vote, but the legal language on that is all like scary language about citizenship. And so there's this huge abandonment rate of you read that and you go, oh shit, like I shouldn't, this says I'm going to go to jail. Like if you are an undocumented immigrant and you read that, you are going to abandon the whole application, not just the voter registration part, because it's unclear. And so, it's really tough to advocate for something that sounds good, but the way it's going to be implemented will have the opposite effect of what you intended. Now, they're not registering to vote and they're not getting SNAP. So, do you really want that? I had this really lovely member of the Georgia state legislature reached out the other day, and I had a call with him, and he said to me, where are the advocates in my community that understand implementation so they can help me? This man has an incredibly diverse population that he is representing in the legislature. It's like I think the most diverse, one of the most diverse, district within Georgia. And he says, like, I just basically spend all of my time with people with low English skills, the recent immigrants, trying to get them the services that government has offered them, promised them. And he's struggling with all the same things we all are, right? The clunkiness of these processes and these application forms. And he's looking for the advocacy community who can work with him, not on like policy intentions, but on the delivery of these services. And I other than potentially working with Code for America, I didn't know what to tell him, because advocacy is so focused generally on the policy.
Yeah. No, I think this is a great point about the assumption that advocates, and no disrespect to the work that they do, that they understand the implementation piece. And I remember I got my stripes early on in my career helping to implement in LA County on behalf of organized labor, Prop 63, which was the Mental Health Services Act. And that was like my first kind of like early grounding into, we all thought this was a great idea, and now go make it reality in a county as big and as complex. And this is just the assumption that advocates really understand the implementation details is just not correct. We have a couple questions, a little bit, well, actually, I'll take the Culture Eat strategy one, because I think this is a little bit aligned, but the question is, the USDS hiring process is unique in the federal government, and outside of the intentions of just being able to recruit the right kinds of talent, how do folks in the government outside of USDS see this as an opportunity or a threat? And examples of this implementation of this model at the state and local level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, let me just refresh myself on the question. Yeah, I actually think that the dividing line between groups like USDS, who are generally hired under special authorities, and the general civil service are often pretty unhelpful. I understand why we do it that way. And I was there for the beginning of it, where we finally found an authority through which we could hire people more quickly, which was necessary. But when USDS can hire quickly, but an agency is going to take 9 months, it's a very big problem, not just because it's 9 months and they need actual staff, but because it creates this sort of two-class system, which is frankly insulting to the people who have to deal with the 9 months. Now, the truth is all agencies can use those hiring authorities as well, but you can't have a system in which you have the civil service rules and then you have these exceptions around them, and somehow all you do is the exceptions. That's not a system anymore if it's never used. Of course, it is used, and that's why we have this, real slowness in getting the talent that we need in government. But at some point, I guess in 2018 or so, USDS decided to take this on and help create something with the worst acronym ever, SMEQA. That acronym, great program. It stands for Subject Matter Experts Qualifying Assessments. And it's too long to explain here, but basically, OPM came to them, Office of Personnel Management, came to them and said, can you help us fix tech hiring? And they said, there's no point in fixing tech hiring. Let's fix hiring. Let's understand why this is taking so long and why a system that is designed to be meritorious, right? The whole thing was we moved in 1893 or something from a spoils system to a system based on merit, but the policies and processes that have grown out of those laws now actually make it very hard to hire on the basis of merit. Lots of examples we don't have time for. There are a lot of detail, I guess, in how that became that way. But I do think USDS, and I'm sorry, I think we're talking about USDS as if people really know what it is, and I can back up there for a second, but USDS is at its best when it is solving core problems for everyone, not sort of swooping in and taking credit for, saving healthcare.gov or something. It's and I think that they tend to gain credit and reputation with the agencies when they're just providing them better tools rather than trying to say, oh, here, you're messing that up, let me do it for you. That's not what they do, but they end up sort of getting a reputation for that.
Yeah, and I think it's, it's equivalent to like, and the person Scott put in here, models at state and local level, right?
Oh yeah.
In government, we're seeing a lot of these kind of innovation groups, if you will. And I think the point that you're making is a good one, which is as much as those groups go broad and kind of help everybody within the institution to solve those problems, then you avoid some of the seeming preference for, I remember when I was at the city, everybody hated, and to some degree, the group with the sticky notes, right? Because the innovation groups always have the sticky notes and all these processes. And I think in some ways what they were articulating is that they're struggling with issues and they weren't getting the kind of attention. But I think to your point, and we see it in the federal government, USDS now building the capacity within each agency or as many agencies and lifting everybody up. I think that's the thing that's going to drive us home. There's another question here about your experience during the time, the challenges that you faced during the time at EDD, and dealing with issues of program integrity and how you navigated that. Were there legal issues that brought up some of those challenges at EDD, and who was against following the exact directives of the legislature? I'm hoping I sort of understand that question well, but I think maybe speak to us about your EDD time and how did you navigate a lot of the program integrity questions, and perhaps as we all do, then council coming in and wanting to drive certain probably less risk, more risk averse strategies.
Yeah, so this person's obviously read the book, and I'll need to give a little bit of background to answer it. During my time at EDD, we were asked to both measure and clear a backlog of unemployment insurance claims. So this started at sort of beginning of August, end of July 2020. So you figure pandemic's been going on for several months at this point, and you've got people who filed for their unemployment insurance in March or April and have not gotten a check in August. This is extremely dangerous for people who are relying on that benefit whose savings has run out. The backlog turned out to be 1.3 million claims. I think I said 1.2 in the book and since been corrected, because I forgot. And the problem was that this agency really had a big focus on fraud. And so, fraud pre-pandemic was frankly not that bad. It's just something that a sort of culture develops because of what I'll just broadly call oversight. I mean, they constantly pilloried in the press and by other government agencies, when there's any amount of fraud at all. But the practices that they were using and I should say, while it was pretty minimal before the pandemic, the creation of the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program and the need to deliver very, very quickly created the opportunity or created the conditions under which actually very large fraud happened, or at least large enough to be like significant. I mean, there's a lot of differences in opinion about whether that amount of fraud that happened was just like the cost of doing business if you're going to get the cash out the door really quickly, or truly unacceptable. And you could easily make a case for either, I think. But there was a lot. And the problem was that the team had a set of practices that they believed were designed to catch fraud that did no such thing. What it did do, though, was it caught legitimate applicants, and that is how we had the backlog. This system of sort of checking your name and your social security number and your date of birth against other databases, and if there was any discrepancy at all, you were considered potentially fraudulent and had to go through a manual process that was so difficult that they really, really couldn't handle it. The fraud protection, the supposed fraud protection practices were creating the backlog and were not protecting us against fraud. And in fact, there was a lot of, I actually have to say, when you say legal issues, I am not sure. There were a ton of legal issues, but when you talk about exact directives from the legislature, one thing to understand is the legislature believed that adding staff at very, very high volumes was the way to clear this backlog, not understanding that if it takes 25 years to become a competent claims processor, adding staff will, the claims processors then have to like take care of and onboard and answer their questions, actually reduced the productivity of the department, not increased it. So the thing and that was a directive from the legislature. And so there was a huge hesitancy by the EDD director to tell the legislature that we had found that we had, done some analysis and found that every staff person that was hired was slowing down processing rather than speeding it up. I guess I would just generally say, having some core competence internally that would have allowed that agency to walk into the pandemic with an ID verification system, for instance, and to understand how their systems work, would have both reduced fraud and increased the ability to get checks to legitimate claimants more quickly. And I think so often we think of these as we're stuck in sort of that world of like a trade-off, and it sometimes is, between reducing fraud and delivering, but there are core things that actually get you both, and that involves having the competency within the agency to actually understand what's going on, and then of course the willingness of the director to be able to tell the truth to those above her.
Yeah, I think, this, and we're almost at time, so this kind of reminds me of some of the initial points that you had made. So much of government is really responding to crisis, right? That it seems to me like we have kind of failed to invest in the basic things that actually will get us to a crisis moment and allow us to respond more effectively. And you mentioned climate change somewhere in the middle of this conversation, and that looms over all of us. And so there's a last question here around, in terms of culture, how do we bring in more of this calculated risk taking? How do we get away from investing in our infrastructure, not just during a crisis, but before the crisis hits? Maybe take us home with, what's the 1, 2, 3 kind of Jen Pahlka recommendations for how we do that as institutions in any capacity in government?
First of all, I think what we need to invest in is people. I hear all the time from people, we haven't invested in tech. And I say we haven't invested in the people who can do the tech well, and you cannot have tech without the right people. Teams before tech. And until we recognize that, we will keep blowing billions of dollars on technology that doesn't work. Second, I think, again, I am trying to create a broader conversation about what creates this culture, and help change the environment in which calculated risk takers work, so that they are not constantly afraid of some very well-intentioned but misguided oversight compliance apparatus that will end up making the culture more risk averse, which is not what they want. But I also think it's important to remember that you can read the book and go like, oh, the culture is bad on those people who created the culture. But the reality is, I love this line from Eric Liu, though he may have borrowed it from someone else. You're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. Like, we are all part of that culture. And while we often feel like there is nothing we can do because this is just how the system works, the reality is, and I think that story proves it, like the system doesn't actually work that way. Like if you look at the law and policy, it does 90% of the time, it does provide implementers the freedom and the flexibility to do the right thing. It's the culture that's created this sense that, no, you have to have the ESB. And we can all, in our own ways, change the culture by what we say and what we do and where we spend our energy and how we support each other in risk-taking. I think so often in a culture of government or a library or whatever, you can start to say, as Yadira did, no, let's do an API instead of the data dumps. And if people around you go like, that's really risky, you know, it kind of sometimes only takes one voice to say, yeah, but it's the right thing. Let's figure out how to do it anyway for you to keep going. So be that person for someone else, and hopefully that someone else will be there for you.
Yeah, that's great. I've been using a lot the phrase, we're the ones we've been waiting for. And as you said, teams before tech. So invest in the people. John, I'd love to turn it back over to you, close us out, but thank you, Jen. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you,
Oh my
Lilian.
God, you guys are so great. And we could keep going for another hour. The one thing I want to tease out, which hopefully doesn't end the optimism of people, the emphasis on people. One quote I wanted to pull out, Jen, was your call near the end to the need to dismantle some of what our predecessors have built.
Yeah.
We must both develop new capacities and clear out the clutter and ways of working that no longer serve us. And easier said than done, right? The worst question I ever asked as a program officer was, what are you going to stop doing? I don't know if I ever asked you that, Jen, but and when I asked that, particularly of librarians that we were working with, that's not an answer that librarians are not in the mode of stopping doing things, right? And so, you know, I'd love anything you want to say landing that. And I also just want to tying it back to the climate discussion. It struck me like everyone else, I think I just read that The Heat Will Kill Us First book. And that's a message in that as well. We could continue to try to maintain the cities and lives that we've had or preserve Paris as we expect it to be, right, in the 18th century, the 17th century, but that's not what the Paris we're going to need for the future. And so any advice for us in library land or us running nonprofit projects of how we, you know, responsibly dismantle some of what our predecessors have built while also building for the future in 1 minute or less?
I think pushing stuff back up the waterfall that's specific, right? I think so often people complain like this is dragging us down, but they don't ask specifically what they want for what they want. Like, let's rewrite this so that it takes out this mandate. Here's the language. Let me also answer the question in the context of us as citizens of the world, not just, you know, librarians or program officers. You know, we have to change the culture of politics too. So the next time a politician asks for your dollar or your vote, ask them about their stance on like, what have they done to improve implementation? What have they done to reinvigorate the health of the civil service? We only ever ask them about their positions, which are essentially expressions of values, which are really important. But like 50% of what they should be proving to us is that they can help get the job done, not just want the thing done.
Thank you. That was great. Lilian, Jen, Josh, thank you all so much. Kat, if I'm going to talk slowly in case there's anything I need to do to wrap things up. If you haven't checked it out yet, make sure to check out thebandbookclub.info, which we launched last week. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for writing this book, Jen. I know I remember when you started it and how deep of dive and lift it was. I feel like the timing for this release is amazing. And Lilian, thank you so much for being part of your first DPLA event. Yay, not the last.
Yay, not the last. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, everyone.
You guys.
Thank you, Kat, for bringing us together. Ciao.
Thank you.